Excuse me. Hello, if anyone's just joining, welcome to the rum tasting. We had a little bit of a glitch this evening, so we're now actually in the Charivale shop, but I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment or two. Just going to wait for everyone to get logged on and etc. I know there's been a few last minute bits today. We've been rushing around like mad today, but yeah. So instead, you've got the overview of the Charivale shop, which is a bit messy at the moment, but hey. So let's see. Hello everyone that's just joined. Just going to wait a few more moments, wait till everyone kind of gets settled, get everyone in as we kind of usually do, then I'll introduce everything. We've had a little bit of a glitch this evening. I've just gone up to our second shop at 358, because that's where we've been usually doing the tastings from. Just tried to log in and the internet's decided it's had enough. It's just not working. So I had to quickly rush back down here and set up quickly. So I think I've got everything that I need ready, but do bear with me if I haven't. It's because we've just rushed around a little bit. It's been one of those days today where it's just been very manic and nothing seems to go quite to plan. But we're here now, which is great. And I hope everyone's looking forward to the rums we've got lined up. We've got some great bits lined up for tonight. We should hopefully have somebody joining us from Black Tot rum as well. I'm just waiting for them to join in the stream. I haven't had anything as of yet, but we'll see what happens. Perhaps they're running a bit late too. But yeah, give it a couple more moments and then we will get started. I've got some good stuff planned. So, there we go. Lovely. So I will give it a few minutes, but I know quite a lot of you are quite familiar with our setups and how we've been running them. There's a few of you that might not have done our virtual tastings before, but I know most of you are familiar with it also. Hello to the people that have been on pretty much most of them, I think. And if you're new, welcome. It's a completely different setup to what we're used to, but we're getting used to it. It's quite fun. And yeah, hopefully everyone got their packs okay and everything. And we're gonna get started. So just a little welcome. This is where we were meant to be in the second shop, but the internet decided it wasn't having any of that. So quick rush back down here. Yeah, we just want to say welcome. Tonight we're looking at rum and theming it around Black Tot Day, which is tomorrow. It's the 50th anniversary of Black Tot Day, which we'll go into more detail about in a moment or two. But it's essentially the day that the British Navy decided they were no longer going to give rum rations to their fleet, which for some people is very upsetting, as you can imagine. But it's become quite a big sort of celebration, and we'll go into more of that in a minute. So in store, we probably have about 100 rums or so. We've got a fair few, and rum is one of those categories that's kind of like everyone looks at gin and goes, "Oh wow, gin's massive." Rum is huge as well. There's so many different styles. There's so many different types. There's different island styles, and then there's different styles within that, and it's a very big category. And it's becoming more and more popular. People are sort of turning a little bit more towards rum, perhaps. There's obviously people saying about the gin bubble having burst, and they're saying, "Oh, what's the next trend going to be? What's it going to be? Is it going to be rum? Is it going to be tequila?" Whether it'll be rum or not, I'm not sure, but it's certainly gaining in popularity. And we've got some fantastic bits in store, which yeah, we will go through some bits today. And then just in some other news, our Charivale shop is open. So I'm currently sat behind this lovely big glass screen. If you come in, you'll see that we've got the counter at the front. We've got a big glass screen up. We've got some kind of rules or whatever you want to call them on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and on our blog as well, just kind of going through like do's and don'ts and stuff, including things like we do have to ask if we can now wear a face covering because it's now the law, and all that sort of fun stuff. But we're open, which is great. It's a little bit different. You can't really browse, but we'll happily bring stuff over to you. I've just got someone at the window waving at me, sorry. Sorry. There's one of the hairdressers down the road. He's just finished. He's after a bit, but I'm with you guys. Anyway, so yeah, that's a little bit about the current times, which is, so yeah, it's good to be back open. Now let's get to the fun bits from Rum, and I'm going to invite Mitch into the stream in a moment, and I'll introduce her. Just quickly, things you'll need for this, quite literally just a glass. If you want any garnishes or to make it into a long drink, then that's great. But these are all sort of sipping rums. We've chosen them specifically so you can just have them neat over a bit of ice if you prefer, just without ice. So yeah, you won't need anything in particular. It's not like the gin tasting where you need to go and have a rummage for some lemons and limes and stuff. But yeah, just simply a glass. Lovely. So Black Tot Day, and I will add Mitch into the stream. Hello, Mitch.
Hello. Hi, Hannah. How are you?
Hi. How are you? Are you okay?
Very good, thank you. We're just getting ready for our 24 hours of rum here, so it's been quite the hectic day.
I can imagine you're rather busy at the moment, so thank you very much for joining in. That's really that was really appreciative.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, what is Black Tot Day? So I will pass that on to Mitch to kind of go through that, and we will. If you want to open your first rum, we're obviously going to be starting with Black Tot because that's the obvious choice. So what is Black Tot Day then? Why is it important today and things like that?
So Black Tot Day is a day that, unless you're a sailor or a real rum nerd, you may not have come across it before. It was the last ever day that they gave out the rum rations to the Royal Navy. Now, before that date, which was the 31st of July in 1970, so 50 years ago today, or tomorrow, before that date, they used to give out a rum ration every day to sailors on the ship. So for 239 years, part of your daily routine was you'd always get rum as part of not just your provisions, but actually part of your pay as well. The rule was introduced in 1731. And when they first introduced it, they used to give everyone a half pint of overproof rum every day.
That's a crazy amount. Overproof is when you've got like the almost like cast strength style spirits.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like
that day. It's just. I do a tasting and I have a few glasses and I think, well, I've done enough work for the day now. I've done some work. I couldn't imagine drinking half a pint and having to do actual work still. So, yeah, that's an awful lot.
If anyone's watching has ever had a half pint of overproof rum or any rum, in fact, you'll know it's quite the time. And this was standard procedure. So 1731 they started this. They've very quickly realized that was far too much rum. People were fighting and throw each other overboard, and it was just mayhem. So they halved it to a quarter pint of overproof rum a day, and they were still getting wasted, and they were still throwing each other over the ships. So they eventually halved it again to an eighth of a pint every day, so about 70 mils twice a day. So half gill every day. So they had these little copper cups, and if you were a junior officer, this would get watered down into what we call Navy grog. So for 239 years, they carried that on. And then finally, in 1970, they said, maybe, you know what, we invented nuclear submarines in 1958. Maybe we shouldn't be getting all of these guys every day, like this big red button, and we're giving them rum. And I don't know about you, Hannah, but if ever I see a big red button and I've had a few rums, I definitely want to see what that big button does.
I'm one of those people where it's like, what does this do? I'll press it. Why not? But I mean, 70 mil twice a day is still a lot in, kind of today's sort of standards. You're looking at what, nearly a triple rum twice a day, which is a lot to take in one go.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so
it was a wild time, and it was but it was one of those things, because life at sea was shit. Like, you didn't want to be on, like, you would die, you might not make it back, so you needed something to give you that Dutch courage, that little you know, a little gusto to get you out there back on the deck.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, it's been, I know it was sort of seen as like a day of mourning, and a lot of the Navy fleet wore like black armbands and had like little funerals and things for them. But it's now kind of turned into a bit more of like a sort of celebration in a way, which is nice to see, especially with tomorrow. And if you've not got any plans tomorrow or you're around, I definitely recommend checking out some of the stuff that's planned tomorrow, because some of it looks fantastic. There'll be some great things going on all day tomorrow online, which would be wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's free. It's free for everyone to join. It's just on our Facebook page on Black Tot Rum. We start at 10 a.m. At 11 a.m. we're going to be raising a toast. So at the exact moment, 50 years later, since the last tots were drawn, and then we're just carrying on, because we kind of figured, you know, the Navy rum blend itself was bringing a world blend of rums together. It wasn't just one or two countries, it was every country around the world. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool to sort of invite as many of our favorite rum people around? So we've got 50 speakers from 15 countries, over 20 brands joining in. It's yeah, it's going to be, if you're interested about rum, tomorrow's going to be an incredible lineup. So,
and there's also a competition running at the moment with Black Tot as well, with the toast, the small ship, the ship's toast as well, where you can win your ration of rum, which I think is 3 bottles. Is that right? Right?
Yeah. We worked it out. If it was the standard, like 70 ml twice a day for a month, you'd get 3 bottles of Black Tot Finest Caribbean. So we've rationed that out for you.
that's a lot of work to have in one go. But
would you? Do you know the toast yet, Hannah? Shall we teach everyone the toast?
We could teach everyone the toast. I think I know it.
All right. So if you're playing along at home, so repeat after me. So Hannah's gonna show you how we do this toast. So this is a 400-year-old toast. It used to be painted on the outside of the old Bushmills distillery in Ireland, and it was taught to me by the person who taught me how to bartend and got me into rum. So I always liked sharing it over a rum with people, and now I get to share it with everyone around the world. So, all right. So repeat after me. If you're at home, this is very important. You have to follow along with us, okay? And we can, even though we can't see you, we can see you. We can feel you, right?
I know people that are doing this, so I know I'll be checking out in
All right. So repeat after me. There are tall ships.
There are tall ships.
And there are small ships.
And there are small ships.
And there are ships that sail the seas.
And there are ships that sail the seas.
But the best ships are friendships.
Are friendships.
So here's to you and me.
So here's to you and me. There you go. Cheers, and that's the toast. Yes, cheers. And on that note, we will we'll have some rum.
Oh yes. So if you're having the Black Tot Finest Caribbean at home, this is a blend of 4 different rums from 3 different countries. So we've got Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica, all blended together there. Now, what have we got here? Yeah, so we've got the breakdown on here. Now, this is something which I'm really passionate about, which I've always found is weird in the rum world, because, like, typically the rum world is famous for being misleading, not giving you too much information, being a bit dodgy. And normally when you see a blended rum, you know, you say, well, what's in it? What distillery is it from? Where is it from? It's like, oh, it's a secret recipe. We can't tell you, you know. And it's like, well, either you don't know, or you're like, what are you paranoid about? You know what I mean? For me, it would be like, I don't know, like, Gordon Ramsay going, I won't tell you my recipe for this dish because you might then become Gordon Ramsay. It's like,
you might make it better than me, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like,
that is not.
Yeah, bullshit. Why not tell people? Why not tell people what the rums are, so that you can appreciate those individual components and what they do, and hopefully when we get to do this in real life, if we get to come in and do a tasting with you,
that'd be really great. Yeah.
You know, we won't just give you this rum, but we'll give you the actual components of the rum as well. So you can try each individual rum ingredient, and then you try the finished blend together. So, I was
going to say they do differ quite dramatically, and it's something we'll sort of touch upon later. But you get really different styles just from different islands, which, even though they're quite close together, they have different kind of ways of working and different ways of how they make their rums. So it's really interesting to see them kind of brought together. And blended rum, some people look at the word blended and kind of go, oh, I don't know about that. But blended, what blending does is actually give you like the best of everything. So, can bring together some really interesting different flavors that perhaps on their own you might think that's perhaps not for me, or maybe that's a bit strong, or I prefer to have it a bit more like this. And then you blend it together and you get some fantastic sort of results from blending. So never be scared of blending. That's one thing to say. Yeah.
Well, this is it, and I feel like if you're coming from the whiskey world where this negative connotation comes from, it's almost like you start off. Almost everyone starts off on a blend, and then they get really into their single malts, and then as more and more experience you get, you go, actually, if a blend's done well, it's fantastic,
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, we say, oh, the islands are close together, but we could say Scotland and Ireland are close together, but a whiskey nerd would be outraged if you said, oh, they're kind of the same thing, aren't they? They're just whiskey, That's what I think. I'm a rum lover. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. It's European. It's European whiskey. It's fine. You don't need to differentiate. That's the same as saying it's Caribbean rum. It's like, you don't need to differentiate. It's all the same. Don't say that on the islands. You'll get shot. It'll be good.
It's a bit like with wine. It's like if you're in France and you're like, oh, French wine, it's all the same. Say that to a French winemaker, and I very much doubt they would agree with you. I think they would be outraged, definitely. And then you do, I suppose, with you get different terroirs, and obviously there's different kind of different ways of life and different kind of people that have either come onto the islands or that have set up from and lived there, and they've got their own sort of their own kind of ways of doing things. Even if there are kind of rules and things like there is in like Martinique, there's still little niches of things that they'll do differently to make their product and to make their kind of rum their own in a way as well.
Absolutely. And you know what, we've been famously bad in the rum industry about educating people and being transparent, and you'll still hear about rums called white, gold, and dark, which is like that's like saying, oh, I like brown whiskey. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Just starting. All right. You've got to get specific. You may have heard like English, Spanish, French.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, like, stop generalizing. You've got to get specific. Like, what's a Barbados versus Jamaica? What are the differences? What are they doing? What's their culture? What's their flavor? And then you start to really understand it. So, part of what we'll do, and again, hopefully we'll, if I'm invited back, we'll get to do these individual islands, and you'll go, okay, wow, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, those are all English islands, and they couldn't be more different from each other.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah. But just kind of like when we were talking about blending, like with this rum's a really good example of it, because it's a really complex style of rum. It's very smooth, and it would work in a whole range of drinks, but it's really quite complex, and that's because you've got those different elements that kind of bounce off each other and bring like different characteristics into the rum. But yeah, I think it's a really fabulous rum, the Black Tot. So,
thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you're all enjoying it at home as well. It's but for me, this is a great like workhorse rum. It's something you can enjoy it on its own, but if you put it in a cocktail, it's ballsy enough, it's big enough, it's got enough flavor that it will just carry through whatever you're going. And sometimes, in fact, it can overpower some ingredients because it's a bit fuller, it's a bit higher ABV. So you've got to balance it out sometimes a little bit if you're playing in your favorite cocktails. But it's it does the job.
So if you were making a cocktail with Black Tot, what would you usually go for, or what's your sort of favorite rum cocktail or cocktail to make with Black Tot rum?
Well, okay, that's a big question. So my first rum cocktail that I'd always make any rum with, because it's the ultimate test, is a daiquiri, because a daiquiri it's the holy trinity of rum. It's rum, lime, sugar, shake it up, put it in a frozen glass, delicious. And from a daiquiri, you can work out exactly what that's rum's going to do. You can work out if it's dry, if it needs a bit more sugar, if like how much citrus it needs. And then from there, every other rum cocktail is kind of a twist on a daiquiri, really. You know, you're just expanding from there. So I always start with a daiquiri, but again, you know, depending on what you want, if you love a rum old fashioned, you know, it's just a daiquiri with bitters and without citrus. You know, it's like you're just throwing it in. And again, you want a big flavor, something that's going to kick through, like you would with a whiskey old fashioned. You want something that's going to stand up to that sugar and that bitters and really, really carry through. So I think it does that well. A rum Negroni, throw the gin away. You've got too much gin already. Like, get rid of that. Put the rum in there instead of a gin. Add your Campari and your vermouth. And you've got a beautiful right hand, we would call it, instead of we call it a right hand.
That's a really interesting cocktail, actually, a rum Negroni or a right hand. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
You know, I'm doing my Italian. Delicious. You know?
Yeah. I'll have to give that one a go. I haven't actually come across that one before, so I'll have to try that and give that a go. Certainly. So.
As soon as we're all open up again, we can hit a bar, come down to Trailer Happiness. We'll go and get some rum Negronis together. It'll be a great time.
Yeah, lovely. That's the one in Notting Hill, isn't it? Trail of Happiness. Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah.
I've heard many good things about it. Unfortunately, we're based in Sheffield. But yeah.
You're up in Sheffield, are you?
Yes, we're in Sheffield. So there is some.
I didn't know that. This is the joys of online. I had no idea you were. I just figured you were down the road. So we'll come on the trip anyway. Come on down.
We're in Sheffield, and yeah, we've got some good bars and stuff around. Some really good bars that you know, kind of good for their cocktails and stuff, but nothing that seems to be quite rum based as specifically. That I lie. There's one called Cubanas, but yeah, nothing like that really like good with rums in. But yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll come up to Sheffield and fix that, and you guys can come down here and we'll
very good for Public, which do some excellent cocktails, but they're kind of like underground and they're absolutely tiny, so it's very difficult with social distancing at the moment. But I think they've opened back up a bit. But they do some really experimental stuff. So that's always, if someone's like, if they're into drinks, where should I go? That's always the bar to go to. But yeah, definitely. There's so good. But, yeah.
I can't wait. Well, make sure when you go to those bars, make sure everyone's tipping your bartenders, because they need some love right now. They need all the support they can get to stay open and keep going. So make sure you look after them and be generous.
So are you still quite involved with Trail of Happiness, or because I know you're the global ambassador for Black Tot rum, so have you kind of moved away from the bartending side of things and kind of focus more specifically on that? Or?
Yeah, so typically now the only times I make drinks are if I'm, you know, if someone's really desperate, basically. If someone's short and I happen to be in town, then I can jump on and make some daiquiris for everyone.
Of course.
But no, like Trailer was the first bar I ever worked at. That was where I started. That's where I learned how to polish glasses. And so for me, it's like it's the bar that got me excited about rum. And so for me, it's like, you know, you support the people who brought you up in
of course,
whatever industry you're in, you know. So for me, Trailer is always that spot, you know. So yeah.
That's good. Well, I did notice they've opened back up again, haven't they? I think on Instagram.
They have. Yeah. So after our 24 hours, if we can stay awake, they've one of the benefits of lockdown has been that they've been able to do like outdoor trading, so they can like one Portobello market now whilst you're there in the day. So they open from 1 p.m. So if we can survive till 1 p.m. on the Saturday, we're going to be at Trailer. So
one hell of a party if you can survive. I've just had a question from Alex Knoll saying, where is Black Tot based? So I'm assuming it doesn't really have a specific base, but I know it is bottled by Elixir Distilleries, which are based in Scotland, I believe.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the rums come from Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica. They get brought in. So the way the rum world works typically is most rum, unless you own the distillery yourself, goes through a broker. And the biggest one in the world is based in Amsterdam, called EA Shear. Now, typically they do all the blends themselves because they're a blender as well as a broker. However, with this, because our guys at Elixir Distillers, they own like lots of different brands, and they're big whiskey nerds, and they do all their blending themselves. So they got the rums from EA Shear. They do their own blending. We bottle it in Scotland, and then the rest of our company is based in London, which is where I am right now. So it's sort of a hard one to base, but sort of all over basically.
Yeah, and we will see with a couple of more of the rums that there's quite a few sort of companies that sort of act almost as like an independent bottler. Quite an interesting way of looking at it. I know we've got quite a lot of whiskies that are like an independent bottling, and you tend to get some more interesting bits and pieces through those. So yeah, there seems to be quite a few that kind of look at doing that. Look at that sort of bottling idea of it, as opposed to it being like we're based in the Caribbean, we're based in Guyana, for example, and this is where we make our rum, and this is what we do. So it gives you a little bit more freedom as to what you can sort of do with the rum. Yeah. So yeah. Well, what did everyone think of that? If you've got any comments or anything, you can add them into the stream on YouTube. I have got the emails and stuff ready there if you want to get in touch via email as well. If you didn't want to set up a YouTube account, but yeah, I thought it was a really good one to start with. Black Tot is a little bit on the stronger side at 46%, but it's a good place to sort of start. And obviously with it being Black Tot Day tomorrow, we could start with Black Tot. So yeah.
We like to give you a little challenge to begin with, like test your palates out. So.
Well, sometimes the higher alcohol stuff can be good as well. It can kind of wake. I find it can kind of wake my palate up a little bit. So if I'm ever doing, I'm a bit odd if I'm ever doing wine tasting or a trade tasting. I like to go with the reds first and then the whites, which is apparently the wrong way to do it. But sometimes the higher alcohol stuff as well can kind of wake your palate up. But if you do ever struggle with the alcohol content on it, sometimes adding a drop of water in can open up different flavors and things as well. And if you ever have something that's really strong in alcohol and it's all you can smell in it, if you start with the glass lower down and bring it up to your nose slowly, it'll help the alcohol sort of burn off a little bit. But yeah, I think what a great one. So yeah, we have an offer of this at the moment as well. So if you buy a bottle of the Black Tot rum, you get one of the lovely tote bags free, which they're great tote bags. I'll just get one from out under the counter. My colleague and I, Sarah, were talking about them. Like, they're lovely, but they're massive and they're very strong. We were talking about them earlier, and we were saying we want one each. But anyway, bit of a side.
I'm sure we can make sure that happens. So,
well, lovely. So I think we're going to move on to the next room now. Mitch, it's up to you if you'd like to stay long, or if I imagine you're pretty busy and you've got quite a bit to sort of sort out tomorrow. You might need an early night if you've got a 24-hour party going on tomorrow as well. So it's up to you if you'd like to stay.
Well, it turns out, much to my surprise, that doing a 24-hour event has much more work than I anticipated. As much as I was thinking I'll be home by now. This will be fine. I'll have loads of time. I'm going to carry on and prepare. But please, we want you all to join us tomorrow. We're on 10 a.m. on the Black Tot Rum Facebook pages. Come and see what we've put together for you. If you're curious about rum, it's going to be a lot of fun. So.
Well, thanks so much for joining in, and I hope it all goes well tomorrow. It sounds like it'll be a fantastic event. It's a shame, obviously, we can't do any of this in person yet, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to get something done in person as well. And have a lovely day tomorrow. It sounds great. So
thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much for inviting me as well. I really appreciate you having me on. So
thank you for coming in. Thanks. Well, have a good evening.
You too. Take care. Have fun, guys.
Bye. Lovely. So that was Mitch from Black Tot Rum, global ambassador, and really lovely to chat to him about Black Tot. And hopefully it gives you a bit of information and a little bit of an idea of kind of what blended rum can be like before we go on to different island styles and different other styles. So anyway, so rum number 2, we are going to go with the Plantation. So you can pop that in your glass. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about sort of styles and their sort of differences and why it is such a big sort of area. So as we mentioned, different styles have different islands have different styles, and you can see on this map here it's quite a kind of complex sort of style of map, but all the little yellow bits are different islands, and you can see where some of these rums come from. Well, you get, as Mitch mentioned, you get kind of like white rum, golden rum, etc., things like that. Rum alcohol, navy rum, spiced rum. And, you know, the basis of this, though, is that they've all come from different islands. So each island would have its own style, and the styles were brought into the islands based on the sort of settlers that you had that came to the islands, which is going kind of way back to the sort of 1600s and that sort of time period when European settlers moved over west looking for the new land, and then the first island they come across is Barbados. So there's a couple that are English sort of speaking. So we've got things like Barbados, Jamaica, things like that. They're English speaking islands, but they've got very different sort of styles. Then you have things like Spanish speaking islands, which have quite a light style of rum. There's French speaking islands as well, and they generally make rum differently to, say, an English style. So they will use sugar cane juice as opposed to actual molasses. But the most sort of common one, so Barbados is known for making really quite elegant, quite fruity, well-balanced styles. And you generally drink a lot of Barbados rum neat. But it's a mixture of both pot and column stills, and that also makes a difference as well, which still they use to make the rum, because different stills will give different flavours as well, and you end up with different kind of results. Jamaican rums are kind of known as the funky ones. So if you've ever had, say, a natural wine or so before, and it's got that slight little funk to it, or it's a bit like you taste something like this is a bit unusual. Jamaican rums tend to have that sort of style to them, and there's a reason for that, because they're usually quite high in esters or flavours, which we'll go more into later. But it's a kind of chemical compound, and they're usually pot stills. So with pot stills, you tend to get richer, sort of heavier, kind of more indulgent styles of rum. Guyanan rum is, it's like a powerhouse, usually kind of medium to heavy bodied, but also quite rich as well. But in Guyana, all the distilleries are under one big distillery, but they've got 9 different stills. So they've got a lot of scope of sort of experimentation in different styles that they can make. I touched on the Spanish-speaking islands, so things like Cuba, Trinidad, Venezuela. They all tend to be a little bit lighter in style, a little bit more kind of, I suppose, savoury. And the aging system they use there, they've got a different aging system. So in English-speaking islands, Jamaica, Barbados, you might see an age statement, so say 12-year-old, etc. Spanish-speaking islands, you tend to see they use a Solera age system, which is what they use in sherry production. So that means you've got your barrels all lined up on the floor, and you've got more on top of each other stacked up. You start off with your rum in the very top barrel, and you leave it in there for so long. Then it gets transferred into the barrel below, and then you take it from the very bottom barrel. So that's what they do with sherry production. And it's the same with the rums that they tend to do as well. So you don't tend to see like if you see an age statement, it's a general kind of age statement, if that makes sense. So the rums in the bottom barrels have been there for, say, 23 years or so. But it's not necessarily like this has been in one barrel that's been there for 23 years. So you can just, even from that, you can see how different and how kind of wide the scope is. And then, of course, there's French-speaking islands as well, which we mentioned, places like Martinique, Guadeloupe, Haiti. They tend to prefer a fresher sort of style, and they use column stills as well. So we'll touch on this more a little bit later, because we have got one from Martinique, which would be good. But they tend to have a little bit more what you might call terroir in them, so they tend to be kind of a little bit more focused on the actual environment they've come from, or you tend to taste that a little bit more in the rums, which is interesting. So the next one we're looking at, we are looking at this one, Plantation Barbados, in this lovely raffia packaging. Just going to empty it off. So, some of you may remember if you did the World Gin tasting, Citadel Gin, the company that owns that, Mason Farad, they are the same guys that own Plantation Rum. And as I was talking about before, you get people that are kind of like almost like an independent bottler. That's pretty much what Mason Farad are in a way. So they're based in Cognac. Mason Farad were a cognac producer. They have something like 4 centuries or so of making spirits. It's now owned by Alexander Gabriel, who's took over in the late 1980s, I believe. He started making gin because he knew he could only make cognac in certain times of the year, so he wanted to use it still for something else. Started making gin, and as his company's grown, he's done a lot of traveling and he's made a lot of connections and built his network. And he started becoming really interested in rum and the rum industry. So he started looking for different unusual casks and things in the Caribbean. Started fine combing them and looking for different bits. And plantation rum, this one we've got here is 2005 Barbados. But if you see on the screen the pictures, there's a whole range of rums there. And we have a couple of different bits from plantation. So you get things like the 3-star, which is a white rum. There's things like they've done things like a Fiji rum. There's, which I think was a little bit mad from what I remember. But there's things like a Jamaican. There's Barbados with no particular vintage, so an age statement one. And then there's kind of things like the overproof and dark. So they do a lot of different sort of stuff. But what they have a kind of core range of things that they do, and then these are the vintages that they will do. And they will sort of pick different kind of casks and years and things, and release them just as a vintage, or a bit like you would do, I suppose, with a whiskey, like with some of the independent bottling whiskies that we've got, where they're not necessarily, this is a 10-year-old, it's distilled in this day, in this date, bottled on this day, and it's 11 years old, something like that. So they do quite a bit of this sort of stuff. So yeah, Mason Farad, let me just double check my notes and see if I've not missed anything. And one of the things about Mason Farad is that you kind of see through his rums as well as his gin, is that they're looking for kind of terroir, and they want to bring the idea of terroir into spirits. Because obviously in France, in winemaking, terroir is massively important. It's, it plays a big role in winemaking. It's one of those things that, if it's why you have kind of like the Grand Crus and things like that, because of the terroir, etc. One of the things that's kind of interesting and a little bit controversial about this is that it ages in Barbados for 11 years and ages in ex-bourbon cask. But they also spend 2 years in France. So it spends 2 years in ex-cognac casks from Mason Farad. And there's a bit of a kind of argument a development come through from the 3 other distilleries on Barbados, which are Foursquare, St. Nicholas Abbey, and the other one, I can't remember what it's called. Clarendon, no. Anyway, there's 3 other distilleries on the island. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll come across it in my notes in a moment. But they've asked for a GI to be put in, a geographical indication. So a little bit like you will see in France, where you have the AOC, or in Italy the DOC, or the DOC, GC, etc. And what these are kind of laws set by the government, or set by a body that say this is how you have to make this in order for this to be called a Barbados rum. So Champagne, for example, in Champagne you have to do these things in this specific way, and then you can call it Champagne. It has to be from the area of Champagne, things like that. And For the most part, Mason Ferrand are like, yes, that's fine. We agree with most of the stuff in there. But the one thing that they are saying, which they don't agree with, is the double aging process, which means taking the casks from Barbados over to France and aging them there, and then bottling them and selling them on. And the reason why they're saying that is that they're kind of arguing the point that taking it away from the island and then still calling it a Barbados rum, you're not actually giving that revenue that you end up selling the rum for back in. It's not going back into Barbados. It's using the name of Barbados, but not actually benefiting people in Barbados. So there's a bit of a kind of thing going on at the moment with it, but it's quite an interesting kind of an interesting sort of thing to think about and look at, because I can see sort of both sides of it, because it's very much part of Mason Ferrand's company. It's what they do with a lot of their rums. They put it in cognac cask. It gives it a kind of quite elegant finish. But so taking that away, you kind of taken away something of their company. But then I can see the other side of it where it's not still in Barbados and they're trading off the name of it being a Barbados rum, yet spent some time away from Barbados aging. It's sort of, you start sort of thinking like, well, actually, can they really do that? Is that particularly fair? But yeah, it's one of those things. The rules can kind of, sometimes having a GI or, the kind of regulations and things are great, and they can be, wow, that's great, we've been awarded this, fabulous. It means that it's a great kind of, the land's great there, they're making great products. However, it can also cause a few issues in terms of it stops people from being as experimental. So sometimes you might see certain products that are from well-known areas but won't have that particular geographical indication on it because they've not met the mark, so they can't legally call it that. So yeah, it's one of those that sort of swings back into a little bit. Yeah, so the rum itself. I've come to the rum itself. So Plantation, they're kind of they've got this sort of fascination between the land and the spirit and agriculture, and they want to link the terroir of rum and agriculture into the bottle and present it to the audience. And this particular rum is from West Indies Distillery, which is one of the largest in Barbados, and it's actually owned by Mason Ferrand West Indies Distillery. At West Indies Distillery, they make things like Malibu rum, they make things like Cockspur rum as well. And it's also worth noting Mason Ferrand also are shareholders of National Rum in Jamaica, which own a couple of different distilleries there. So this is how they've kind of built up the company, and they built up the kind of contacts. So this is how they can get hold of some of the rum, and they'll distill different things as well. So they have their own distillery in Barbados to make it. But it's made from molasses with this, and there's 4 different distilleries at the West Indies Distillery. 4 different stills at the West Indies Distillery. 1 superficial column still that recycles the steam, so it keeps it like a continuous cycle, which makes quite really light sort of styles of rum. There's an older column still, which isn't as efficient, but because it doesn't recycle the steam and it's a little bit older, it means you can have a smaller production run on there. And it can also be made to make one that's a little bit heavier. And then they've got 2 copper pot stills as well, which make heavier sort of styles of rum. And this one is a mixture of both. So they use both copper pot and column stills. I'm not entirely sure which of the 2 column stills it is. They weren't as that specific when I was doing my research. But again, you get 2 different sort of styles of rum blended together in that. But this one's just purely rum from Barbados. And it has 3 days of fermentation. And we'll touch upon why the length of fermentation is important when it comes to the Jamaican rum. There's a little bit more to it than that, but fermentation plays a really big part in rum making. Probably, more so than it would do in gin, and it's probably more so in whiskey, perhaps. But yeah, fermentation is really important in rum, because it's where you kind of develop most of your flavours. Distilled in 2005, bottled in 2018. So as I said, 11 years of tropical aging in ex-bourbon barrels. And most rums you'll see that are aged in, generally in the Caribbean will choose something like an ex-bourbon barrel, and that's for a very particular reason. The Caribbean has a very hot, can be quite humid climate. So anything that's new oak, so if you say use American new oak, you generally tend to get those really big, powerful vanilla flavors, that slightly buttery kind of notes to it, that adds that buttery kind of note. Whereas if you're using an ex-bourbon cask, if it's already had whiskey in it for, and had a lifetime of producing whiskey, the wood's softened a little bit. So you get some, you soften those sort of really powerful flavors that you would get from the oak. So it makes it a much more, much calmer sort of environment to put the rum in, because it's not going to be kind of attacked with all these big, powerful flavors. It just it's going to nicely round it out. It will impart some flavor, but nowhere near as much as a new barrel, or perhaps say something like a sherry barrel as well. Sherry barrel will give like a really rich, very rich fruity note, which you don't, you'd argue, would you necessarily need for rum. But yeah, so it's quite important that they use, an ex-bourbon barrel or something that's a little bit kind of more neutral. And then, as I mentioned, it has 2 years in cognac cask in France, Chateau de Bonnet in Ars in France. So as a rum itself, it's quite complex, but it's a more delicate style. So the Black Tot is quite big and bold, quite punchy, lots of stuff going on in there. But this one's a little bit more delicate. You get kind of more nutmeg and vanilla, a bit of citrus in there as well. So yeah, it's a really pleasant nose on that one. Percentage-wise, it is 42.8%, so a little bit lower in percentage than the Black Tot, which was at 46%. But initially, it's sweeter on the tongue for me, and then you get the spice sort of building in the background, and you get that kind of, where I put butterscotch, it's that sort of like caramelly, creamy sort of butterscotch on the palate. So it's a really very elegant style of rum, much fruitier, and very smooth, which makes it ideal for sipping, which is kind of what most Barbados rums are designed for. Or I think it would work quite nicely in quite a fruity cocktail. So say, in lockdown, I did actually make some quite fun rum punches with this. I say rum punch, but it was more of a case of, what do I have in and can make a cocktail with? And we had some rum, we had some pineapple juice, a bit of lime, some other things in there. Fun times. I don't know if anyone else has found lockdown has got them experimenting with different things, and they think maybe I should just leave that to the professionals. Now the bars are open, I'll leave that to the bartenders. But yeah, it's a very delicate sort of style of rum. It's something that you could kind of sit and just contemplate and drink over time, I think, which is, yeah, really lovely. We mentioned about barrels and about why it's important, and I said about tropical aging and kind of what is tropical aging. And it's essentially, tropical aging is when you age it in the Caribbean, because of the heat there, it accelerates the process. So 1 year in the barrel in Barbados might be equivalent to, say, 2 or 3 years in Scotland. So that's why you often see the ex-bourbon cask being used as well. And the other thing that ends up happening as well is angel share. So if you're a whiskey drinker, you might be really familiar with this, but if you're not, angel share is what they call the amount of whiskey that evaporates. And it used to have a story that the whiskey was being evaporated and going up to the angels, and they were enjoying it. But it's something that happens quite a lot. So when you're aging with any spirit in cask, there will always be some evaporation in there. But you tend to see, in Scotland, you'll see about, say, 2% per year, which I think, it can end up adding up and being quite a lot. So if you're aging a whiskey for a really long time, for example, you're going to end up losing a fair bit from it. but I think in South America, in the Southern American states where they make a lot of bourbon, I think it's about 4 to 5% a year. In the Caribbean, it can be around about 6 to 7% a year, which is a lot of rum to lose in a cask. Bearing in mind, some of the casks aren't always massive. Some of them, go for slightly smaller style casks. Some of them go for bigger style casks, depending on how much flavour you want to impart on your rum. So it can, there's a reason why you won't necessarily see rums that are up to the ages of perhaps some of the Scotch whiskies and things like that. So you tend to see things like a 12-year-old rum. We've got something like a 12-year-old Dorley's, and that would be equivalent to, say, like an 18-year-old whiskey because of the aging process of it. Because the aging just happens much quicker. So that's also why Mason Ferrand decided to take the barrels and age them for a couple of years in France. It slows down the process. It's putting them into a different cask, in a cognac cask, so you get that quite elegant finish. And they can opt for a sort of drier, cooler cellar. And that drier environment can bring out sort of spicy, more floral characters, whereas the humidity of say Barbados can bring out the fuller kind of characters and make it a little bit more structured. So Mason Ferrand, argue that that's why it's important, and they've also argued that double aging is something that has been happening for years, and it's been an important part of rum making as well. So yeah, there's tropical aging is tropical aging versus continental aging. There's kind of arguments for both sides of it, but it'll be interesting to see the outcome of that. It's relatively new. I think it's only sort of published in February this year, so it'll be interesting to see what happens to the outcome of that, whether they end up granting the GI, whether there's some agreement that they come to with it. But yeah, it's a lovely, but still lovely rum anyway. And yeah, lovely, a really nice presented bottle as well. And this raffia was to symbolise, or to kind of nod to the history of rum and its products and things like that as well. So lovely. So, any thoughts on that one at all? If anyone has any thoughts, let me know. Which one? Let me know which one's your favourite so far as well, and how you're drinking them as well, because that can always affect it as well. Because I did mention on the emails that we're doing sipping rums. You don't need any. We're not sending out any mixers or anything. But if you do prefer it as a mixer, it'd be interesting to see how each one works as a mixer. So yeah, lovely. So a little bit about how it's made. So I mentioned about pot and column stills, and if you're not kind of sort of into some of the production side, you're probably thinking, what on earth are you on about pot and column stills? So there are two different types of stills. You have traditional copper pots and you have big column stills, and they will affect, as I mentioned, they will affect how rum tastes. They'll affect how most spirits taste, depending on what still you use. But rum itself, you need sugarcane. So wherever you can grow sugarcane, you can make rum from. And originally, sugarcane actually got brought over to the Caribbean. It was thought it got brought over by Christopher Columbus in the late 15th century. But ever since then, it's been a really valuable crop in the Caribbean. And it's very, very influenced by its soil and the climate. So they can affect the levels of sugar that are in the cane. So it usually has to be hand harvested, the cane, and they estimate that you can cut about 3 tons a day. The slight issue with sugar cane is as soon as you cut it, it's very susceptible to bacteria, to infection, so it can go off very, very quickly. So apparently there's a Jamaican saying, from kill to mill in 24, so you have to get it to the mill to get the sugar, to extract all the sugar from it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it ends up just rotting and then you end up with a product you can't use. So there's two ways of using it. There's two sort of different products you can make from sugarcane. First of all, they extract all the sort of like pure sugar out of it, the crystals and things, and you end up with a byproduct called molasses. And that's the basis for the majority of rum's molasses. And this is like a thick kind of syrup. It's just the middle picture on here. Or I think it's actually called black treacle in the UK. I didn't realise black treacle was actually molasses. I think that's what it is anyway. So this is like this really thick, gooey, quite high sugar content syrup, but that's perfect for rum. And then the other thing that you can end up with is sugarcane juice. And what they do with that is they press the canes, and then you end up with all the juices that come out, a bit like you would do with grapes when you press them, and you end up with the juices, and you can ferment that. Not too dissimilar to winemaking, you can ferment the juice. So you have two sort of different products. Obviously, you've got the really sticky, gooey, rich, sugary syrup, and then you've got the lighter, still quite sugary, but the lighter sort of juice. So you can see how, depending on what you decide to ferment and make your rum from, you're going to end up with two different sort of styles of rum from that itself. In order to make rum from molasses, you do need to dilute it slightly. So you'll need to add a little bit of water, and then you add yeast into it. And then that's how it starts converting everything. So it's converting it right through from, well, starts converting the sugars and making it into alcohol, which is always fun. And like, as I said, fermentation is a vital step in rum production because it's where you produce your esters, which are flavours. And I'll go more into esters when it comes to Jamaican rum because they're known for high esters. And esters are essentially like a chemical compound that will build in your rum. And this is where I think it probably helps if you've got a background in biochemistry, which I do not. It can get quite kind of confusing as to what means what. But certain flavours will develop the longer you leave something. So depending on what you want your rum to taste like as well, depends on how long you want it to ferment. And if you control the temperature, you're going to end up with less esters, so you're going to end up with more specific sort of lighter styles. And then if you can let it run free, you'll end up with different sort of heavier, more punchy sort of styles. So the whole sort of process is a little bit, it's quite a whirlwind. There's a lot that goes into just making rum itself. So that's why I sort of said, with gin making, you get quite kind of, well, you usually start with a neutral spirit and then distillers can add in different botanicals, etc. But with rum making, there's a lot of decisions before you've even made any spirit or before you've even got any sort of spirit. There's a lot of decisions to make in order to get what you want. So once it's fermented, there's two different ways of doing it: pot or column stills. Pots are just like a big giant kettle, so you put everything in the bottom, you boil it up, and then it goes through and you collect it. Column stills are the long, tall ones. They can be continuous, but they generally make a cleaner spirit. So if you're making something like vodka, for example, people tend to opt for column stills, whereas cognac producers like a pot, you have to use a pot still if you're making cognac. So they will add they'll give you different sort of styles of spirit, and pot stills tend to be fuller and heavier bodied sort of spirits, whereas column stills tend to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more crisp. However, column stills are great for if you want to have consistency from batch to batch. Pot stills, you have to do one batch, clean it out, next batch, clean it out, etc. So each batch might differ slightly, depending on how you kind of look after your still, etc. Sometimes as well, column stills, some purists might argue that pot still is the only way to go. You should only use pot still, but column stills can sometimes get a bit of a bad rep in that they're kind of associated with bigger companies that are looking for consistency, that are just wanting to kind of churn out, bottle after bottle after bottle. But they can add some, they can be really interesting. They can add some some great kind of flavours to it as well. And if you prefer a lighter style, if you want that lighter style, then the column still is great. Yeah, as the rum comes out, as with pretty much all spirits, when they've come off a still, it comes out clear, and it's the oak that will give it the flavour. There is some distilleries that will add in sugar. They are allowed to do that, and it might sound mad. You're thinking, you're making a product from sugar. Why do you need to add more sugar in? However, no sugar actually, if you've got the sugar in the bottom of a pot still, there's no sugar that actually ends up in the liquid that comes out, because it's the steam that obviously rises up and condenses. So they can add sugar in to make it to its desired sweetness. And some can add colouring in as well if they want it to look darker, and they, sometimes there's obviously sort of quite common opinion that the darker the spirit, the older it must be, which isn't always true. But yeah, there is a few things that they can do like that. Quite a few of the rums that we've got, I think most of them, if they have got any sugar in, they tend to be quite low in sugar, and I think most of them are relatively natural as well. But it is something that they can do, so something to maybe just be aware about. Finally, once they've aged it and once it's been in oak and it's spent its time there, they will decide to blend it, much like they will do with whiskey as well. They'll choose different casks to blend into a bottle, and that can, for some distilleries, is one of the most important things that you can do. Okay. On to the next rum. So we have, now we're on to the fun one here. We're going with this one, the Mezan, number 3, which is Jamaican, the Mezan XO, the Jamaican. Now, I say it's the fun one. When you look at the colour of that, it's completely, in comparison to even the Barbados, the colour of it, you can see the colour difference is it's very light. I think, oh wow, it's really, really light. Must be really young. It's actually got blends of rum in there, which is something like between the ages of 4 years old and 23 years old, which is quite mad. But this one in particular, Mezan, they don't like to add anything to it. They like to just leave the rum as it is. So as I just mentioned, you can add things into it. So you don't add any extra sweetener, no added colour. They leave it unfiltered. So this is what I'd call the natural rum. As I mentioned, if you've had any natural wines before, this is like the funky natural one that's, you think, some people will probably go, it's not really for me, that one, and other people will be like, I love this. So it depends on kind of how you feel about funky rum, whether how much you like it or not. But when you smell this one, it's a very pungent rum, and it's got that kind of quite strong aroma of bananas. And you get the sort of sweet spice, a little bit of tobacco as well in there, a bit of sort of smoke, but very light though. So Mezan rum, why is Jamaican funky? What on earth do I mean by it's funky? Now, despite what I said earlier as well, I did say earlier that Jamaican rums, oh, they're lovely, rich, they're those rich, dark, quite eluding styles of rums. This is obviously the complete opposite of that. Having said that, though, it's a really good example of how you get that, how the sort of flavours build in Jamaican rums, and it's a good kind of, it's an interesting comparison to some of the other rums that might have a little bit of sweetness in them, or like the Barbados rum, to sort of compare side to side and to understand how when you start blending them, how they will play off each other. Because if you think back to Black Tot, and think how they kind of work together, these two, when you start adding them into each other, you kind of make some interesting, and you can end up with some different styles that work really nicely together. So Mezan itself is what I'd sort of call as like an independent bottler. So they don't have their own sort of specific distillery. They are like Plantation, where they will source different casks and things like that. And they do also do a little bit of continental aging, I believe, as well. But the rum inside the bottle is a blend of rum made from molasses, so not made from sugarcane juice. But it's a blend of I believe, 2 different rums, one from Clarendon Distillery called Monumusk, and one from a rum from Hampden Distillery. It doesn't say exactly which casks they were or how strong the esters were in there. So it's quite difficult to say how much of each has gone in each. But if you're familiar with rum at all, you might have heard about Hampden being kind of like a bit of a cool one. Hampden they're kind of a very traditional style of rum distillery, but they can make incredibly high ester rums, and they can make some incredibly crazy funky stuff. So we get some people that are like big into their rums and the big sort of big collectors, and they just see Hampden and they're like, they love it. Not that that's a bad thing at all, by the way, if anyone is that person. So what am I talking about when I mean ester? As I mentioned earlier, it's like a chemical compound. It's an organic compound, and it's a byproduct of fermentation. So a little bit like sulfites are a byproduct of wine making. You will always get esters. And esters, essentially, the simplest way we can explain it is that they are flavours. So, you could say one ester is this flavour, and that will have one different chemical compound or different chemical kind of name. This ester is a different flavour, and this has its own kind of chemical compound. And in order to get them, you need to allow for fermentation. So the longer the fermentation and the less controlled the temperature is, the more likely or the more esters you'll end up having. And this is where Hampden are famous for this. So generally speaking, I don't think they tell you the fermentation. They don't tell you the exact fermentation for this one. But generally speaking, Jamaican rums will be higher in esters, but you get kind of what's called common cleans, which is between 80 to 150 esters. You get plumber styles of rum, which are between 150 to 200, which are they're fermented for 2 days. So if you've ever heard of Way and Nephew Overproof, that's a 2-day fermented between those 150 and 200 esters in there. Then you get what's called Wedderburn, which is a 200 plus esters in there, which are fermented for longer, and you get more acidity building. Then you get continental styles, which are 500 to 1,700 esters, which is a 5-day ferment. And they also use something called dunder, which when you make whenever you make a spirit, there's a waste product in the bottom of the still once you've boiled it and it's collected. And they reuse that waste product to build more flavour into it. It's not harmful. It's not a bad thing. It's not that they're not being clean with the stills, but it is something that they do, particularly places like Hampden, when they're doing those longer fermentations, and that helps build into more flavour into your rum as well. Now, continental ones are usually sold for a European market, but they're also usually sold for blending and aging, sometimes for food flavouring, scents, perfumes, etc. They're not necessarily always made for pure drinking. However, Hampden Distillery can, if they really need to, build esters up to about 3,000, which, if you think you're leaving your rum to ferment for 5 days, which is a really long fermentation in the alcohol industry, and then there's Hampden there, and we can double that. You're thinking 10 days of fermenting, there'll be some absolutely crazy flavours in there, some incredibly strong and overpowering flavours. So with that, it's one of those where esters can be really interesting, but those are sometimes where the kind of funkiness comes from. So if you're not a fan of like really overpowerful flavours, that's where it can be like, I'm not sure I'm overly keen on the funkiness of this. But that's kind of what I mean by funkiness. Sometimes the funky can be like quite overpowerful flavours, or flavours you wouldn't necessarily expect to come through. So sometimes I know that some the ones that have the longer fermentations, it smells like rotting bananas. And you think, do I really want to be drinking something that has a bit of a rotting banana smell? But there's certain wines that we've tried as well that they smell very much like a field, or very much like a fertilized field, to put it one way. So there's a few wines we've tried that are natural wines, and they do smell they do have that kind of really quite musty, almost that smell to it. That you're like, this is going to be nice, and then you taste it, and it tastes fantastic. But it's that smell. That smell can be a little bit, and that's what we kind of mean by the idea of funky. It's usually things that you think, is this what I want in there or not? And some people, they love that idea. They love it. Other people aren't so keen on it. Me personally, I think I like things that are just going towards that, but aren't too much. I like to play it safe. I like to stay on one side of it. But yeah, so the fermentation part is really, really important. And there'll be a couple of distilleries and a couple of producers where they kind of think, the fermentation comes from the actual yeast they use themselves. But you can choose different yeast, and that will also add different flavour. And if you choose certain yeast strains, you have more control over what flavours you're building as well. Whereas people like Appleton Distillery, that's where they kind of like to focus. They want a specific type of yeast. It gives certain flavour profiles and things like that, and that's where it's kind of important. Whereas for people like the owner of Foursquare Distillery, so Richard Seal, he quite simply said that it's bullshit. It's actually his words, that bullshit, apparently not. And he said that it's actually how long you ferment it. So, but the idea is that if you have a short fermentation, you'll only develop certain flavours, and certain different compounds. Longer fermentation will allow for heavier, sort of deeper flavours as well. Anyway, back to the rum before I get too sidetracked. So this one, as I said, mixture of Hampden Distillery and Clarendon Distillery, and a mixture of pot and column stills as well. So the column still, Hampden do, I think, are all pot still. I don't think they have any column stills there. So the column stills probably come from Clarendon Distillery, but the column still element will just help lift it a little bit and stop it from going too over the top or too funky, and it will help bring it into a bit more of a lighter, more vibrant sort of style of spirit. And as I mentioned, the age of the rum in this is between 4 years old and 23 years old. So you blend. This is one of the beauties of blending. You can blend in all sorts of stuff. Blending in something as young as 4 years old and stuff that's nearly 6 times older than it. Is that right? Yeah. 23 years old. So once they've done that, once it's been aged, they blend it all up. And then they re-age it in next bourbon barrel to allow the rums to marry together. And I can't remember. I think they also do that on a continental aging, I think. But that's something I'll have to double check on that. Anyway, so the idea of this, you bring those kind of high, crazy, full flavour rums, high esters with lighter sort of styles, and you get a lovely mixture in the middle. In terms of a rum, you still get that natural sweetness coming through. For me, it's that sort of natural sweetness that you get when you've had kind of like fruits or like that sort of style of sweetness. It's not necessary. It doesn't feel confected or anything like that. But there's like a kind of a smokiness at the back of the palate now, and there's a sort of quite refreshing note on the back of it. And you definitely get that kind of fruity, but like those bananas coming through at the beginning. There's a little bit of spice in it as well, which is nice. And I think this type of rum is, as I mentioned, it's one of those that if you like that sort of more unusual style, this will probably be more up the street. But I also think it's something that would work quite well in quite complex but delicate cocktails. And what I mean by that is things that might need a couple of ingredients, or you want something for them where things need to be balanced quite carefully. And I think this will do a really good job at that, because I think one of the things about this is really quite nicely balanced. It's a very interesting style of rum. I think that will be one that kind of grows and changes as well. Yeah. I think if I was out of the plantation and the mezan, probably say I'm probably more, if I was just kind of wanted something to drink without thinking about it too much, I would go for the plantation. If I was happy to sort of sit and actually really contemplate and taste, then I'd probably go for the mezan. I think the mezan would work. I think it would also work quite nicely if you had some, you know, some like ginger beer or ginger ale, because it's got a really spicy finish actually for me. And yeah, something to just kind of kick that up a bit would be really nice, I think. So yeah, a really interesting style of rum, the mezan. And again, they do a different range of stuff, so you can see in the picture. We've got the picture's got the XO in there, and then they've got some of the vintages as well. And the Light Plantation, they do different ranges. So they do like a single cask, Jamaican, things like that, which I don't think we've got any at the moment. It's stuff that we've had in before, but yeah, they do some really some quite unusual sort of stuff. So if you were looking for something a bit different in rum and a bit crazy and a bit odd, I'd go for mezan. Lovely. On to the next one. Oops, dropped one. It's fine. The bottle's fine. It's just fallen off the little table I've got. Put that there so it doesn't fall off again. So, I was a little bit nervous about doing a rum tasting because when it comes to gin tastings, I could probably talk about gin for hours and hours and hours, and I just would go on and on and on. But rum, there is an awful lot in rum that you kind of need to do your research in. And this next topic, we're sort of talking about the history, is one of those. And it's one of those as well. I think you could spend days and hours doing your research on it, and still have more to learn about it. It's a very, very interesting area of rum. And I think sometimes it can be overlooked as perhaps not being as important, or not having. I think people just kind of sometimes think rum as one big entity and don't always realise the ins and outs of it. Perhaps not so much, not so much as like whiskey or gin, where there's a little bit more focus on the different sort of styles and things like that. But the history of rum is very, very interesting and actually quite dark. It's also very complex as well. So if any of you that were on the gin tastings, the first gin tasting we did touched upon the history of it, and there's a lot that goes on in the history of gin, but in terms of its complexity, I'd say it's actually quite straightforward in comparison to rum's history, because one of the things with rum's history is that it's very intrinsically linked with the slave trade, and it's also linked into the American Civil War, and a lot of it is it's very political as well, which tends to be a theme within spirits and alcohol. A lot of it can end up being political. But rum sort of, when I was reading it, I was like, it kind of like sunk in a little bit more that there's a lot that's gone into rum as we know it today. And it's not particularly pleasant, to put it one way. So I thought I'd do a little brief history, because the history of rum, you could go probably, like I said, probably talk for hours about it, because there's a lot in there. But rum itself starts with the actual plant, sugarcane, which is the official name for it was Saccharum officinarum, which is where they think they got the word kind of rum from, or where they believed it derives from. First cultivated in New Guinea 10,000 years ago. Super fast growing, quite a hardy plant, so it makes it really easy to propagate. It soon spreads across the world, turns up in places like India, and it's not until 1493 when Christopher Columbus sailed west that he took sugarcane with him. And when they the first island they come across is Barbados, and that becomes the sort of the start of where rum is the start of rum. But they did also settle on other islands like Puerto Rico and Jamaica, Cuba, etc. Started planting the sugar there. And at this time in history, the sugar was starting to become more popular in Europe. Europeans started to get more of a taste for it, and it started to become a commodity. So it was the Portuguese that were actually first, first saw the potential for sugar, and they established plantations on the mainland of Brazil. And they were the ones that were sort of supplying most of the sugar to Europe. But it's one of those things that, at the time, it was, if you had sugar, you were seen as wealthy, you were seen as, sought after because you could afford to have sugar. It was not something for the poor, it was something for the super rich. And, I think sugar can be addictive, even we know now, if you have too much sugar, and, you see that it can end up being addictive. And I think that's essentially, what happened in Europe. It's not something that we can grow particularly well here. Sugarcane probably really doesn't grow very well in the UK and the, other European climates. So it became really this sort of big commodity that people had to have it. So there was quite a big rush, and it started this kind of fight over these islands in the Caribbean and surrounding area. So different nations, Spanish, the French, the Dutch, ourselves, the English, we all wanted to establish a presence there. We all wanted to supply our own lands with sugar and sugarcane. And this is where you start seeing the sort of legends of pirates in there as well, and the adventures of Henry Morgan, which is what Morgan's rum is based off. So you start seeing those sort of stories come through from that. And it was in 1650 that the first rum was recorded, or what they sort of supposed as rum, and they reported it as the chief fuddling made in the island is rum bullion, alas, kill divil, and this is made of sugar canes distilled, a hot, hellish, terrible liquor. So rum bullion is an old word for tumult or uproar or sort of that thing. So rum bullion, it didn't have particularly good reputation at the rum at the time. But at the time, it was the European settlers that brought different techniques of distilling to the islands and things like that. So it begs the question if people are making letting molasses at the time ferment, not realizing it, and then drinking it, it's probably not particularly pleasant. But yeah, because they were left with this dark, sticky waste material, molasses. And there was other things of doing. You could do other things with it, but it was more than often just a waste material. But it could be quite highly intoxicating if you left it to ferment and just drank it. So each country, each sort of settling wanted to bring their own sort of techniques to it as well. They all had knowledge of distillation, particularly the Dutch and the English and things like that. The French with sort of cognac making, etc. And they wanted to have something a little bit stronger. Bearing in mind they just sailed across the Atlantic, they wanted to be able to drink something a bit stronger. So they started distilling this waste product and making rum. And it also meant that it couldn't spoil as well. So the waste product couldn't keep fermenting and going to a point where it's just not okay. And Barbados at this point, they were kind of like the master distillers of everything. They were the ones making the most money. I've got in my notes here that they were making about $5 million worth of cane production in 1655, which is a crazy amount of money. And because where Barbados is on the map, it's the most easterly of the islands. It's the first and the last port of call. And it soon became that rum was more sought after and more valuable than sugar itself. So it started becoming a currency. And because it was becoming more popular, more people wanting it, they were needing more people to work for them. They were needing slaves. And this is at the same time that we're looking at things like, cotton being imported, coffee, tobacco, things like that. So along with these sort of things and the slave trade, rum was being used as a currency within the slave trade to bring slaves into these islands, and they were working in the plantations and things like that. So it's, when you kind of look into it, you think it's a little bit of a like, oh, didn't quite realise that. Sometimes it's quite easy to look at, say, a bottle of Black Tot and think, well, that looks lovely, doesn't that look nice? But the history behind it is quite kind of intense. So they used to obviously transport slaves from Africa. Molasses was taken to mainland America to be made into rum as well. And then it was in New England on the coastline that then raw materials would be transported over to England or Europe. The rum was taken back to Africa. It was used as a currency. So they used to use it, for example, 8 small pigs was worth 8 gallons of rum. 3 tons of rice was 360 gallons. If you wanted a canoe, you could get it for 1 gallon of rum. One woman, which is weird, is 200 gallons of rum, and 1 man with 225 gallons of rum. So yeah, it's one of those that was like, oh. And it wasn't, it's a way of controlling population. And rum at the time was insanely popular. There was hundreds of distilleries on these tiny islands. Rum nearly became the drink of America before they started making their own whiskey from corn. And then when you sort of fast forward into the 18th century, into the sort of 1700s, you start seeing really heavy taxes put on British colonies, because at this time we'd colonised the east coast of America, and there was a revolution growing. And this is where it all gets quite complex, and there's an awful lot to sort of read into in terms of the history of it as well. But eventually, the taxes that they were putting on the rum coming in, etc., eventually helped lead to the American Civil War, and obviously things like the Boston Tea Party as well, which led to our sort of downfall of that. And one of the reasons that started is because America started taking the molasses from the French islands like Haiti, etc. They were making more than us, the British Isles at the time, and it was a lot cheaper. So this is kind of all where it started from in that sense. And then it came to a head in the Civil War, and we kind of lost that British Empire. But there is still, you still see with these islands like Haiti, Martinique, etc., are French speaking. We have the English speaking islands of Barbados and Jamaica, etc. So it's quite interesting when you kind of look at it from that point of view as well. But yeah, there's different techniques that the settlers brought. You sort of still see slightly today in the island styles as well. And we're going to go on to the next one, which is from a French island. And you can see see how these have influenced them, even though there's a lot more of this kind of, a lot more blending going on, and international blend, getting different rums from different islands and things, into island blending, that's what I'm looking for, going on. And it's less so of a distinct, this is this very particular style, this is from this island, this is this very particular style from this island. There are still elements of that present in today's rum. So yeah, it's a really interesting, quite dark sort of thing to look into, but well worth looking into, particularly if you're looking at doing any research into the sort of slave trade and things like that, how rum sort of played its part into it as well. So anyway, we're gonna go on to the next rum. I'm gonna keep it a little bit more lighthearted now, and we've gone for the Trois Rivières. So this is the Trois Rivières from it's a VSOP. And you notice the spelling of this, I put a H in it, the rum, and that's because it's the French spelling of rum. Get rid of that. I'm just going to clean my glass out. So it's ready. Also, the pictures that I use in most of these tastings are from their sort of social medias. So I do a little bit of research. So, things like Instagram and Facebook, they've got loads of fantastic images on it. And the gin ones, lovely, nice to look at some different ones. The rum ones were making me very jealous I wasn't on holiday, because Trois Rivières especially had some fantastic images of beaches and all that jazz. So if you want to make yourself feel a bit like, oh, why am I not there? Go and have a look at them. There's some lovely images, but it'll make you wish you were in the Caribbean. Anyway, so Trois Rivières, a different style of rum, completely, from the Isle of Martinique. So rum agricole is almost not really like rum as you would kind of expect it to be. These guys use pure sugar cane juice. So they press the juice and then they ferment the juice. And as I mentioned earlier, you get a lighter sort of style of rum coming from that, because you're not getting that really heavy, sticky molasses sort of style. But yeah, it's an interesting sort of style. And when you smell this one, you'll notice the nose has got quite like vegetal, almost herby sort of hint to it. And then it kind of develops like into richer sort of sweeter fruits. But just as before I sort of swirled it, that was that first thing I got from my glass, was that kind of really quite herby style. And the French are very well known for making exceptional wine, etc. And they're very proud of their terroirs they've got there. Some of the most expensive wine in the world, DRC, is from some of the most exceptional vineyards and exceptional terroirs, and it's that can really make the difference as to why you end up paying for certain wines, etc. It's not necessarily the person that's made it; it's sometimes the actual terroir it's come from and the quality of the grapes. And the same goes for the rum from Trois Rivières. So Martinique was settled by the French in the 1600s and 1630s. Coffee and cotton were the main sort of crop. But by the mid 1700s, so 1767, they changed. This had changed, and they had something like 450 factories producing sugar on the island. And when I think back to if you think back to that first map that I showed, the island is tiny. It's really tiny. Let me see if I can just find it. So, not sure if you can see that. So this is Martinique here. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving on the screen. Martinique's here. It's to the right-hand side in the middle. It's not very big at all, not in comparison to some of the other islands. And you think, 450 factories producing sugar on that particular island, that's an awful lot in that space. It's gone one too far. But they obviously rely on the crop, etc. And I've mentioned about if they didn't do it within 24 hours, it got infected and not usable. So there was a couple of things. There was that, and there was also France is very, very. They like to protect things a lot. They like to say this is our doing, and we want to protect that as much as possible. Which meant it limited kind of their exports on rum. So it meant it kind of nearly collapsed rum making in Martinique. In 1940, the amount of distilleries was 124, which is still a fair amount, still a lot in there. And today there are only 9 distilleries in Martinique, with about 17 brands in total. Having said that, Trois Rivières I've said about the brands being protective. Trois Rivières comes from, on the bottle, it will say on here, on the very bottle, appellation d'origine contrôlée, which, if you're into your wine, you'll understand is the AOC, or which means they have been granted the AOC, an appellation d'origine contrôlée, which means they are protected. So if you're making, as I was mentioning earlier, if you're making rum from a certain island. This is what Mason Farad will find in at the moment when Barbados are wanting to put a GI in place. It protects what you make from them. So there will be certain rules that they have to follow. There's certain things that they have to do, but that means that it can be called a rum agricole, which is rum from Martinique. And it's interesting because it's one of those things where you think it's great. It's great that France has given this to this island, to one of its colonies, but it's the only place outside of France to have been granted an AOC, and they're usually quite particular about granting them. So they're not particularly easy to get. It's not a case of sort of, we'll do this, this, and this, and we'll get it. They can be really quite strict about you getting it, and then that can also filter into after you've got it. You have to be quite strict with how you make things in order to make sure you get your to make sure you kind of qualify for the AOC. Like for example, going off on a bit of a tangent, we do have a wine in store, which is just up on the shelf up there. We can get down in a moment. From a winemaker called Freddie Torres. He's based in Spain, in Priorat. He makes Priorat. But this particular vintage, it was made in Priorat, but in order for it to be a Priorat, it has to be something like 13.5%, and he missed the percentage. He missed the alcohol content, so it was underneath. It was only about 12.5%, which meant he couldn't call it a Priorat. So it's called Freddie Torres Classic instead of Freddie Torres Classic Priorat. So it's this one here. This one is his Priorat, but it's not a Priorat. It's very. It can be one of those things where it's really great having that in place, but it can also be probably, as you can imagine, very frustrating, like in that sense, where you've just missed your mark for it. But Trois Rivières though has got the AOC, and they do make their rums in a very specific manner. And their rums always tend to have a quite aromatic edge to them. They're known for being quite fine, being sort of aromatic and also reflective of its environment, which I think is something that a lot of French produce tries to do. So they like the idea of terroir. As I mentioned earlier about Mason Farad, even though they're using rum from that's not from a French island, they still want to bring the idea of terroir in there. It's something that happens a lot in France. Terroir is really important. So when you sort of taste it, you don't tend to get as much sweetness on that. It's very, very smooth to drink. Very smooth to drink. But it definitely has a slightly more savoury note, and it finishes with a sort of aniseedy, like anise style, quite almost like minty that finish. So you get more of like a herby kind of note coming through. It's less about it being sort of sweet, and it's less about the kind of molasses, if that makes sense, and more about the actual environment that the sugar cane is grown in. So the environment it's grown in, they have quite a short fermentation at Trois Rivières, so they only have about 24 hours. And when you think back to the Mezan rum that we just had, and that has some of the Hamden rum in it, and they're making rums that are fermented for, say, 5 days or so. So 24 hours, it's a really quite short period of time. But you get the fresher notes in there. So you get those kind of more crisp, the more vegetal notes, the fresher sort of style of notes coming through from in that period. Where the longer you leave it, you'll get those heavier sort of notes in that. And that's what they really wanted to do with that. They didn't want all the heavy notes in that. Bearing in mind it's made from sugar cane juice as well, not from molasses. So you're wanting it to be a little bit lighter in style. They have a short column still, which makes an earthier sort of style of spirit. So a long column still, if it's got longer to go up, you're going to get really pure, clean styles. Shorter the still, the richer the sort of styles are, and the more earthy sort of styles you're going to get in there. And that's certainly something that I think comes through in this. certainly get that sort of slightly earthy sort of style through. And you'll notice on this one, it says VSOP on it. So VSOP is something used in brandy production. So they obviously use it in cognac and Armagnac. And it still means as it does in cognac, very very special old pale. And this is also where you start to see the differences between all the islands and things as well. So because of France, that's when they're distilling things, that's what they sort of do. That's how they age it. They don't go for a specific age statement. They go for a general age. I think you have to age it for a minimum of 5 years for it to be VSOP. And then an XO, I think it was 6 years for it to be an XO. But that's according to the classification of the AOC. So if they decided to take it out of the barrel and then, take it out of the barrel a couple of months before, maybe a couple of months before it got to 5 years, they wouldn't technically be allowed to call it VSOP because it has to spend 5 years in there. So that's where there's pros and cons to having a GI and having the geographical indication. But yeah. So yeah, it's quite a deceptive rum, this one. It's a much more unusual style of rum. It's not something that I would say necessarily is super sweet. A little bit like the Mezan. I think if you want something a little bit different, a bit more unusual, these are really interesting sort of styles of rum. And they kind of liken this to a bit like an Armagnac, almost reminiscent of that sort of style. So if you are interested into brandies and things like that, it's kind of maybe a good sort of starting place. And if you wanted to get more into rum, or if you're into that sort of more quite elegant style, perhaps something like this would be really good. I think it would work really nicely in an old fashioned as well, that one. But when I've just tasted it, then there's like a real kind of earthy hit, quite a bit of like bark almost. Yeah, definitely a different sort of style. Very elegant, very, very elegant. And relatively easy to drink actually as well. Yeah. So lovely. And then I think we're going on to our last rum now. Yes, I've just got my last rum to do. And the last rum is one that I think many of you will be relatively familiar with if you're into rum. It's the good old Diplomatico Reserva Exclusiva. On the bottles that I sent you, I called it Diplomatico Res X, but that's because I'd given up at that point and I didn't want to write Reserva Exclusiva on each of the labels 28 times over because it was a bit intense by that point. Bearing in mind I'd done all the other ones already, but we nickname it Diplo Res X as well. That's what it's called. Diplomatico. So Diplomatico is from Venezuela. So we've moved out of the Isles of the Caribbean and got on to mainland South America in the top of it, and it's kind of just inland. It's about not far from the Andes mountains. So it's by a little town called La Mille, and it's about 100 kilometers north of the equator, northwest of the Andes Mountains. And one of the things that really benefits Diplomatico is they've got a high elevation, so they're at 1,000 meters above sea level. And I think I've abbreviated, so where I've put ASL on the screen, that means above sea level, just so everyone knows. It's distilled by a company called Destilería Unidas SA in Venezuela, and those were part of the World Gin Tasting. And we had the Canema gin, which was the Brazilian, which was the Amazonian one, the one that used botanicals from the Amazon. It's the same distillery that make Diplomatico. I think I mentioned on that if you've had Diplomatico, or if you're familiar with that, that's where that comes from. It's one of the most decorated rums out there. It's constantly winning awards. It's constantly in the top 10. It will be one of those that will, for some people, will go, really not into that. It's too sweet. Especially if you kind of like more earthy, sort of smoky styles. But for some people, they'll love it, and it's known as a sort of dessert rum, and it's fantastic over a bit of ice cream, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. So the distillery itself, distiller Unidas, they've got some fantastic kind of features there. They're incredibly lucky. They've got some really natural resources, incredibly clean spring water from the Andes Mountains, and they've got some great natural resources there. Because of that, they make sure that they are kind of green with their practices. So over 100% of their water is recycled. 100% of their solid waste is also recycled as well. And since 2005, they've planted something like 6,000 trees to try and offset their carbon footprint. So they're quite, they're considerate about what they're doing there, and they're big on making sure it's a green distillery because it's important for them. And as I mentioned, that they've got an advantage at being 1,000 meters above sea level. It really helps the aging process. So we're talking about tropical aging before, and the aging process in the Caribbean, and how you end up with things happening quicker. It's a quicker aging process. As soon as you start going higher up, as soon as you start getting into the mountains, etc., the sun. Sorry, I've just seen someone saying the Diplomatico is amazing. It really is a very lovely. When I'm just swilling my glass out. But yeah, as soon as you start going up and you get higher up, you see it with winemakers as well, that they want the elevation, they want the grapes to be high up because it can protect them a bit, and it helps keep it fresher. You get a fresher style. The acidity is protected more. Whereas when it's close to the ground, if you're in a really hot, sunny environment, you get over-ripened. You have to be careful of over-ripening things, because otherwise you end up with some, with kind of stewed fruits sort of flavors, and the acidity can end up being off on things. And the same applies for like aging and things as well. They are at an advantage being higher because the temperatures drop slightly, the humidity isn't as intense, and things slow down a little bit. So you still get some of the tropical aging, obviously, because of where they are. They're really close to the equator, but you're not getting the intensity that you would do in perhaps some of the other Caribbean islands that we've looked at this evening. So you get, some different sort of styles of that. They also age them more horizontally, the barrels. So you can see in the picture there that they've got like a really big barrel warehouse, all of which are done horizontally, and they must do it for at least 2 years, which is, I think, one of the longest aging processes. So you can age, for it to be called rum, a little bit like whiskey. With whiskey, you have to age it for, say, 3 years for it to be called whiskey. In Venezuela, for it to be called a rum, it has to be aged for 2 years. So I mentioned that those, Spanish style are lighter in style, and again, gone against the grain, but for a really heavy style. That being said, though, they generally are a little bit lighter in style, and Diplomatico is made from mainly sugarcane honey. Now, sugarcane honey I've not mentioned, but sugarcane honey is like a richer version of sugarcane juice. It's not quite molasses, not quite as heavy, but it's not quite as light as sugarcane juice. So it's similar, sits somewhere in between the middle. And it undergoes a long fermentation as well. So I don't think I've got the exact amount that it goes. No, I haven't found out the exact length of the fermentation, but a long fermentation though, which builds esters and those flavours. However, you don't get the funkiness that you do in Jamaican rums with this one. It's a blend of copper pot still rum and 20% light rums, though. When they say light rums, it generally means column stills and stuff that isn't, stuff not as heavy, stuff that might have had a short fermentation as well. And then it's aged for 12 years in ex-bourbon barrels. So, you've got from this an incredibly rich, quite seductive style of rum, quite a complex style of rum as well, but quite smooth. And when you look at the colour of that, it's almost like, it's almost like a sherried whiskey. It's, really interesting style, but neat. It's so smooth, so just velvety. I think that's the word. Yeah, it's very velvety, and you get kind of like this thing, like you get bits of like chocolate in there, some of the spice like cinnamon and clove, like Christmas sauce style spices, bit of fruit cake. But then there's also as well, because of the sort of thickness of it, you get like, this is gonna sound odd, you get like rum and raisin ice cream. So I've got this on my notes, and I'm thinking, do I put rum and raisin ice cream on there? I was like, that's a bit of an odd thing to say. But when you taste it, I get that sort of style of like rum, like creaminess and rich fruits. But yeah, quite chewy, like chewy toffee, hot fudge sauce, and I mean, it works really well as a sipping rum. This one is absolutely fantastic as a sipping rum, just with a bit of ice. But I honestly think just put it over some ice cream. I think that would be great. Or you could experiment a little bit with some sweet style of cocktails. If you were looking at maybe making an espresso martini, swapping out the vodka, putting that in instead, that would make an interesting espresso martini from that. And I think it's one of those that, yeah, it's so smooth. It's one that it's always good to finish with, this one. I think if I'd done this and then decided to show you the Trois Rivières, you would have been like, it's a bit, Trois Rivières is a bit, but sometimes the order of things really kind of comes into play with spirits and things like that. But just seeing Andrew Wilson, don't know if it's me, but the feed dropped out. I apologise if it has dropped out. We've had some trouble with the internet today. I think the internet's working all fine here, but it should. YouTube will record it, and it will be able to you'll be able to reaccess it afterwards when it goes up. So if there is anything you've missed out, you can watch it on there, and also let me know, and I can always talk through any bits you've missed out or as well. But yeah, so we've come to the end of our tasting now, and I can see that at the moment I think the Diplomatico has probably been the favourite. But I hope from that you kind of gathered, there's all sorts of different styles of rum out there that, I mean, not to add any more confusion to an already confusing industry, but there is all sorts of different styles for different tastes and different kind of like events. So, the Black Tot rum, as Mitch was saying, is fantastic for kind of like having in and just fancy a rum and coke. I'll have some of this, or let's make some cocktails, great in cocktails, or just have a little sipping rum. And then you get things as well that's like the Trois Rivières, if you want something quite complex and a bit more unusual and a little bit more savoury. And then things like the Mezan, which are just, to be perfectly honest, in comparison to to say like Diplomatico, it's just a bit mad in its style. So there is an awful lot out there that you kind of can go for. So I think with rum, it's one of those things that people sort of think, oh yeah, I like rum. I know I like rum. I like this. But as Mitch was saying, you kind of need to be a little bit more specific about what it is you like. So hopefully this has kind of shown you a little bit as to different island styles and how different techniques will affect it all. So just having a look through the comments, top three are number two was Plantation, which is, yeah, I think if you want an elegant style of rum, I always think, something to kind of sip and enjoy, but also something that will work in cocktails. I think that's really good. And then Diplomatico is $42.95 in the shop. Sometimes at Christmas we have it on offer. But yeah, $42.95 in the shop. Which, yeah, not too bad at all. We do have some little tiny minis as well, which I think is £6, somewhere hidden in the back. Yeah, and for each rum, I will have a little think about some different cocktails for them. When I was doing research, just reading Alex's comment about what cocktail would you suggest for each rum. For doing research, there's all sorts of different kind of cocktails you can do, and using kind of a lot of our suppliers, they've got really good advice on their pages and things. Particularly for us as a shop, they've got some, all the tech sheets and things like that, but they also have some really good servings on there. So three of the rums that we tried tonight are through a brand supplier called Specialty Brands, and they've got some really great ideas for cocktails on there. So the 3 rums we've had from Specialty were Black Tot, Trois Rivières, and the Diplomatico as well. So if you're looking for some cocktail ideas, I'd definitely check out their website for some stuff. And also, I always like to pop on here some useful resources. These are websites that I've used for some of my research. The other person that's really good for cocktail ideas or just general alcohol knowledge is Jeff, because quite a bit of he could probably tell you the whole history of rum off the top of his head. He's really clued up on it. But yeah, so I'll do a bit of a research for some of those. I think I've got your email address, Alex, so I'll send you over some ideas for different ones. But as Mitch said as well, one of the best ways to test rum is in a daiquiri, a little bit like you might do with a margarita, with tequila and a margarita, or a lot of bartenders like to judge each other on how well they can make things like a Manhattan or things like that as well. So yeah, I would say maybe try it in a daiquiri. And then one of my boyfriend's favourite cocktail of all time is a dark and stormy, which is rum, lime, bitters, and ginger ale topped up. Yeah, I think something like the Barbados rums, like the Plantation, you can take something quite fruity. I can't say I'd necessarily go for something overly fruity with the Mezan, because I think you kind of lose a little bit of the flavours. I think it would kind of pull it back a little bit. And I think for the Mezan, as I kind of mentioned, something that's quite delicately balanced, something that's a little bit, perhaps a little bit complex, would work quite well for that. Or if you are going for something fruity, something that's balanced in terms of fruit. I did see a cocktail idea for Mezan that was had a couple of different fruits in it. It was something like grapefruit, there was some pineapple in there, lime, but they were all in quite small amounts. And some of them were as a syrup, some of them were as a pure juice, etc. Diplomatico, I think, depending on how you like drinking it, I think give that a go in something like an espresso martini or a sweeter style of cocktail. That would be really interesting. Yeah. If there's any other questions that you have, let me know, of course. But yeah, there's some. I would also check out some of the social medias as well, because they often will put cocktail ideas up and things like that for all the different ones. And I've popped the social medias, the tags just on the screen there as well. Yeah, and if you are around tomorrow and you're not, Friday night thinking, oh, what should we do in this weird lockdown limbo where we can but can't go out? I'd try and see if you get involved with Black Tot rum stuff. There's going to be all sorts of stuff going on all day tomorrow. They've got a whole program, like Mitch was saying, he's doing a 24-hour day. They've got so much going on. Some really fantastic speakers. They've got people like Luca from Velier Rum, which he's a very elusive kind of well-known rum character. Paul McFadden, who, if you were on the World Gin Tasting, the one that talked through Citadel Rum, he's going to be doing a bit of a presentation in the day as well. And as I said, sort of stuff from all over the world. So it'll be a really interesting kind of day. And I think there'll be some interesting conversations that will go on there. And again, some really good cocktail ideas. So yeah. Okay, well, I hope you've all enjoyed it. You can see that I think probably Diplomatico has probably been one of the favourite ones of the night. But I'm also glad to see that there's a few people that have enjoyed things like the Mezan as well, and obviously the Plantation. But yeah, lovely. We are open, as I said, we are open. So if you are interested in some other rums, let us know. We can. We can't unfortunately allow people to browse the shop, which is a bit of a pain. But it kind of worked in our favour as well, because we've still got deliveries going out, and at the moment you can just see the nice top bit of the shop. The floor's a bit of a mess, there's a few boxes around. So it kind of works in our favour in that sense. But yeah, we're happy to help, happy to talk through some stuff. We unfortunately don't have any don't have sort of tasters open at the moment. We usually have a fair bit open for people to taste. We don't at the moment. Hopefully later on in the year that'll change and we can open the shop up a little bit more again. But yeah, if you're after some rum, let us know. We'll come down and we can help you choose something. And yeah, I really hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I hope you have a lovely weekend as well. I realise we're now at 2 hours. I'm tasting this one today. But lovely. Have a lovely weekend, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for joining.